August 1944. The air on the island of Tinian was a thick, wet shroud tasting of salt, rust, and the ghosts of burned things. For the surviving Japanese nurses and the handful of other female auxiliaries, huddled in the belly of the transport truck. The world had shrunk to this vibrating metal box, a cage rattling them toward a fate they had been taught to fear more than death. The dust kicked up by the tires coated their cracked lips and matted their hair, a gritty final sacrament. They were the remnants of a shattered garrison, women who had traded silk kimonos for blood-stained fatigues, their delicate hands now calloused from binding wounds, with dwindling supplies and digging graves in the unforgiving coral rock. Their minds, however, were not broken. They were forged into a single unyielding conviction, a shield of ideological certainty polished by the Emperor's divine will and the absolute tenets of the Bushido code. Capture was the ultimate shame, a stain on the soul that no act could ever cleanse. To be taken by the Oni, the American devils, was to be consigned to a hell worse than any battlefield. Their leader, head nurse Chio Watanabe, sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the sliver of blinding blue sky visible through a gap in the canvas cover. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face a mask of stern composure carved by years of discipline and the recent horrors of the siege. Around her, the younger women huddled together, their fear a palpable thing, a low hum of terror beneath the engine's roar. There was Akiko, barely 20, her eyes wide with a fanatic's light, still whispering prayers for a swift and honorable death. There was Setsuko, a quiet, observant woman who had served in Manchuria and had seen the myriad faces of brutality, yet still believed the American version would be unique in its depravity. They had all seen the propaganda posters, leering, ape-like soldiers with claws for hands, their eyes burning with a subhuman lust. They had been told stories of torture, of unspeakable violations, of being used as human shields. Their only remaining power, they believed, was in choosing the moment and manner of their end. Many had failed in their attempts, their cyanide capsules lost, their hidden blades discovered. Now they were simply cargo, being delivered to their tormentors. The indoctrination was total, a psychological fortress built brick by painful brick. They were the daughters of Yamato, divine in their origin and purpose. The enemy was a decadent monolith, a culture of soft, greedy individuals incapable of true sacrifice or collective will. Their strength was a hollow thing built on material excess, not spiritual purity. The Americans, they were taught, were clumsy, wasteful, and prone to panic. Their machines were mighty, but their souls were weak. The women expected to see this weakness firsthand. They expected cruelty born of fear, incompetence masked by bluster, and a fundamental lack of the stoic grace, the gammon, that defined their own people. They steeled themselves for the beatings, the starvation, the humiliation. It was a known quantity, a script they had rehearsed in their minds 1,000 times. What they were not prepared for, what no training or propaganda could ever have inoculated them against, was the quiet, baffling weapon their enemy was about to deploy. But in the suffocating heat of that truck, they were not soldiers preparing for a new kind of battle. They were merely women, exhausted and terrified, bracing for an end that was terrifyingly unknown. If you're finding this glimpse into the psychological landscape of war compelling, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the hidden fronts of human conflict. The truck shuddered to a halt, the sudden silence deafening after the prolonged roar of the engine. The canvas flap was thrown back, and a column of blinding, merciless sunlight pierced the gloom, forcing the women to shield their eyes. Silhouetted against the light stood the first Oni. He was tall, impossibly so, and the sharp lines of his helmet and rifle seemed to confirm their worst fears. Yet he did not shout, he did not drag them out by their hair. He simply stood there, waiting, his face unreadable in the glare. Another soldier appeared, a corporal with a tired, sunburnt face and eyes that held not malice, but a weary sort of curiosity. He gestured with his hand, a simple, non-threatening motion. "Out," he said, the foreign word flat and devoid of anger. Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to climb down. their bodies stiff, their muscles screaming in protest. They expected to be shoved into a line, to be struck for their slowness. Instead, the soldiers merely watched, their rifles held in a casual, non-aggressive posture. This was the first anomaly, a tiny crack in the monolithic wall of their expectations, cruelty they could understand. This quiet procedural patience was disorienting. They were led into a large tent, the air inside still and hot. A long wooden table had been set up, and behind it sat an officer and an interpreter, a Nisei with a conflicted expression on his face. The women were processed one by one. Their names were taken, their ranks recorded. Chiyo, speaking for the group, was prepared for interrogation, for threats against her nurses, to extract information. The questions, however, were mundane. Did they have any injuries? Were they sick? Did anyone require immediate medical attention? Chiyo's answers were clipped and defiant, her posture radiating contempt. She reported no injuries, a lie to show strength, though several of the women were nursing shrapnel wounds, and all were suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. The American officer, a young captain with pale blue eyes, listened intently, nodding. He then said something to the interpreter, his voice calm and even. The Nisei turned to Chiyo. "The captain says you will all be given a medical examination, a meal, and fresh water. You will be assigned to a barracks. Your personal effects will be returned to you after they have been inspected." This was the second blow, a subtle but powerful strike against their certainty, medical care, a proper meal. It had to be a trick, a deception designed to lower their guard before the true horror began. They were herded out of the administrative tent and toward another larger structure, from which a strange, savory aroma emanated, a smell so foreign and rich it made their empty stomachs clench in a painful knot. Inside, they were given metal trays and guided along a line. A cook, a large perspiring man with hairy arms, slopped portions of food onto their plates without a word. They stared down at the contents in stunned disbelief. There were steaming chunks of beef in a thick gravy, a scoop of mashed potatoes glistening with what looked like butter, 2 slices of impossibly white, soft bread, and a metal cup filled with a dark, steaming liquid that smelled bitter and strong. Coffee. For women who had been subsisting on diluted rice gruel and boiled roots for months, this was not food. It was a hallucination, a feast fit for a general, being served to captured, disgraced enemies. They took their trays and sat at the wooden tables, their movements stiff and automatic, their eyes darting around, searching for the catch, the poison, the hidden meaning behind this absurd display of generosity. They could not know that this simple meal was the opening salvo in a campaign that would dismantle their entire world, not with bullets or bayonets, but with the relentless, crushing weight of inexplicable kindness. The collision of ideologies often happens in the most unexpected places. If you want to explore more such historical turning points, make sure to like this video and join our community of history enthusiasts. For the first week, the women existed in a state of profound and suspicious vigilance. They treated every interaction as a trap, every offering as a poisoned lure. The clean water that flowed freely from the taps was surely contaminated with something to make them weak-willed. The soft wool blankets they were issued, one for each woman, must be infested with some invisible disease. The daily meals, which continued with the same baffling abundance, bacon and eggs for breakfast, thick sandwiches for lunch, roasted chicken for dinner, were part of a psychological experiment, a way to fatten them up before some terrible ordeal, like pigs before the slaughter. They whispered among themselves in the dead of night, their voices low and urgent in the clean, orderly barracks that felt more alien than any trench. Akiko, the young fanatic, insisted it was a sign of the enemy's decadence. "They are trying to corrupt our spirits with luxury," she hissed, her eyes gleaming in the dark. "They think our resolve is as soft as their bread. We must resist. We must show them the strength of the Yamato soul." Chiyo encouraged this interpretation, for it was the only one that made sense within her worldview. She enforced a rigid discipline within their barracks, ordering the women to perform morning calisthenics, to meditate, to recite the imperial rescript on education. They had to maintain their spiritual purity in this den of material excess. They ate the food, but with a detached, clinical air, as if it were merely fuel, refusing to show any sign of enjoyment. When an American medic came to their barracks to conduct the promised examinations, they met him with a wall of silent hostility. He was a young man, barely older than Akiko, with a gentle demeanor and surprisingly skillful hands. He cleaned and dressed the festering shrapnel wound on a young nurse's leg, his movements efficient and painless. He applied a salve of sulfa powder, a miracle drug they had only heard whispers of, from a seemingly bottomless container. He then wrapped the wound in a thick, sterile gauze bandage, the likes of which Chiyo hadn't seen since she left Tokyo. He did this for all the injured women, his expression one of neutral, professional concern. He offered them aspirin for their fevers and aches, tablets they swallowed with suspicion, waiting for the adverse effects that never came. The pattern began to repeat day after day, with a consistency that was more unnerving than any random act of violence would have been. The kindness was not an aberration. It was systemic. It was a part of the camp's very infrastructure. The guards who patrolled the perimeter fence were not the snarling beasts of the posters. They were young men who looked bored, homesick, and occasionally curious. They would sometimes smile or attempt a clumsy greeting in broken Japanese, gestures the women met with stony silence. One sweltering afternoon, a guard saw one of the older women stumble from the heat. Without a word, he unhooked his own canteen from his belt, walked over, and offered it to her. She stared at him as if he were a serpent, refusing to take it. He simply placed it on the ground near her and walked back to his post. The water remained untouched, a silent testament to their fear and confusion. But the image of that simple, humane gesture lingered in their minds, a persistent, troubling question mark. This wasn't the behavior of devils. It wasn't even the behavior of conquerors. It was something else entirely, something for which their conditioning had left them utterly unprepared. The foundation of their reality was beginning to tremble, and they could feel the hairline fractures spreading through the bedrock of their convictions, threatening to bring the entire structure of their identity crashing down. What happens when the reality of war defies all propaganda? We delve into these questions every week. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the complexities of history. The cognitive dissonance intensified with each passing day, becoming a constant thrumming hum in the back of their minds. The external world, this American prisoner of war camp, was operating on a logic that was fundamentally incompatible with their internal one. This wasn't a war of spirit against spirit. It was a collision of two separate universes. The evidence of this was everywhere, in 1,000 small, mundane details that, when accumulated, formed an unassailable argument against everything they had been taught. It was in the camp's sanitation system. Deep, well-maintained latrines, regularly sprayed to keep down the flies and the stench. They remembered the overflowing disease-ridden pits of their own encampments, the dysentery that had claimed more lives than enemy bullets. It was in the laundry facilities, where they were given bars of strong-smelling soap and told to wash their clothes in tubs of hot water. The simple, profound luxury of being clean was a forgotten sensation, and its return felt like a betrayal of their comrades who had died in filth. The camp infirmary became a focal point of their collective disbelief. It was not a tent, but a sturdy wooden building, screened against insects and astonishingly clean. Chiyo, as the senior medical professional among the prisoners, was sometimes asked by the American chief medical officer to assist, a request that both honored and mortified her. She walked through the infirmary as if in a dream. The shelves were lined, row upon row, with medicines and supplies that she thought existed only in textbooks. There were bottles of plasma, cartons of penicillin, boxes of morphine syrettes, rolls of sterile cotton, and surgical instruments made of gleaming stainless steel. She saw a young American corpsman discard a slightly bent hypodermic needle into a sharps container. Her mind reeled. On Tinian, she had been forced to use the same 3 needles for an entire battalion, sharpening them on a whetstone until they were blunt and pitted, boiling them in brackish water, and praying it was enough to stave off infection. The casual wastefulness of the Americans, which they had been taught was a sign of their moral weakness, now appeared in a terrifying new light. It was not waste, but a symptom of an almost infinite supply. It was the logistics of a god. The psychological pressure of this environment was immense. There were no beatings, no torture, no overt cruelty, but the women felt as if they were being dismantled, piece by piece, by an invisible force. Their shared identity, forged in the crucible of deprivation and sacrifice, began to fray. In their own army, scarcity had been a virtue. To endure hardship, to gammon, was the ultimate expression of spiritual strength. A soldier who could fight for days on a single rice ball was superior to one who required 3 full meals. But here, that entire value system was inverted. The Americans didn't endure hardship. They eradicated it with overwhelming logistical power. Their strength didn't come from a spiritual willingness to suffer. It came from an industrial capacity so vast that it could afford to treat its captured enemies with a level of care and comfort that was unimaginable to its own soldiers on the front lines. This realization was profoundly humiliating. It suggested that their suffering, their sacrifice, their stoic endurance had been for nothing. They had been priding themselves on their ability to withstand a fire, while their enemies simply had the power to extinguish the flames altogether. The women began to look at their guards differently. They saw the letters they received from home, the photographs of smiling girls and clapboard houses that they sometimes looked at during their long, boring shifts. They heard them laughing at a shared joke or complaining about the heat. They were not monsters. They were just men, cogs in a machine so powerful and efficient that it did not require them to be cruel. The machine itself did the work. Its quiet, relentless hum was the sound of its power, a power that could provide clean water, hot food, and life-saving medicine in the middle of a war zone, thousands of miles from its own shores. The Japanese women had been trained to fight an army of demons. They had no defense against an army of well-fed, bored, and casually humane administrators. The psychological impact of logistics is one of the most underrated aspects of warfare. If you agree, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives. This constant low-grade assault of decency began to trigger a painful and unwelcome process of comparison. The women's minds, unbidden, started to drift back to the world they had left behind, a world now cast in the harsh, unflattering light of their current reality. Setsuko, the quiet veteran from Manchuria, found herself staring at a young guard as he ate a chocolate bar, a Hershey's bar, its brown paper wrapper a symbol of a distant, carefree world. She remembered the winter of 1939 in Manchuria, the gnawing hunger that was a constant companion. She remembered soldiers boiling their leather belts for sustenance. She recalled a young private, no older than this American guard, crying from the pain of frostbitten fingers, and the commanding officer who had beaten him for showing such weakness. The guard finished his chocolate, crumpled the wrapper, and tossed it carelessly into a nearby bin. He hadn't savored it. It was just a snack, a momentary distraction from his boredom. For Setsuko, that crumpled piece of paper was a more potent symbol of enemy power than a tank or a battleship. Akiko, the fierce young idealist, struggled the most. Her entire identity was wrapped up in the purity of the Japanese spirit and the divine mission of the emperor. The kindness of the Americans was a personal insult, a deep-seated mockery of her faith. One day, she developed a high fever, her body racked with chills. She tried to hide it, to endure it as a warrior should. But Chio, seeing her pale face and shivering frame, informed the guards. Within minutes, the young medic was there. He diagnosed her with a severe infection, likely from a small, overlooked cut on her arm. He gave her a shot of penicillin. Akiko tried to resist, to fight him off, but she was too weak. She fell into a feverish sleep, convinced she would wake up in the spirit world, having been poisoned by the enemy. Instead, she woke up the next morning, the fever broken, the pain in her arm receding. The medic came to check on her, smiling gently, as he took her temperature. "Much better," he said, the words translated by the Nisei. Akiko turned her face to the wall, shame and confusion washing over her in hot waves. She had been saved by the enemy, by their miracle drug. Her body had betrayed her ideology. She felt a profound sense of self-loathing, mingled with a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of gratitude. Chio watched these internal struggles with a growing sense of despair. She was the leader. It was her duty to maintain their morale. their spiritual fortitude. But she herself was waging the most difficult battle of all. As a nurse, she had dedicated her life to the preservation of life, a calling that was often in direct conflict with the military's demand for sacrifice. In the field hospitals on Tinian, she had been forced to make impossible choices every day. With only a handful of bandages, who would she treat? The officer with a chance of survival, or the enlisted man whose wounds were almost certainly fatal, with a dwindling supply of morphine who was more deserving of a moment's peace from agony? She had performed amputations with a rusty saw and no anesthetic, holding down screaming men as they begged for death. She had watched dozens of young men die from simple infections that a single dose of sulfa could have cured. And now she lived in a place where such supplies were not only available, but were used on her, the enemy. The humiliation was a physical pain, a constant ache in her chest. It felt as if her entire life, her entire professional struggle, had been a cruel joke. Her desperate, heroic efforts to save lives with nothing were being mocked by an enemy who could save lives with an almost careless ease. The most corrosive element was the sheer ordinariness of it all. The American soldiers did not seem to view their actions as particularly noteworthy or virtuous. They were simply following procedure. The camp was run according to a set of regulations, the Geneva Convention, a document the Japanese women had never heard of. For the Americans, humane treatment of prisoners was not an act of mercy. It was a matter of policy, a bureaucratic imperative. This stripped the situation of any personal honor or shame. The women were not being singled out for special treatment, either good or bad. They were just numbers on a roster, cogs in a vast, impersonal system of containment. And this, in its own way, was the most devastating realization of all. Their epic, spiritual struggle for the soul of their nation was, to their enemy, just a problem of logistics and administration. This deep dive into the internal world of prisoners of war is central to understanding the true cost of conflict. If this resonates with you, please share this video with others who appreciate nuanced historical storytelling. The slow erosion of their worldview needed a final cataclysmic event to bring the entire structure down. It came not in the form of a battle or a grand announcement, but in the mundane arrival of a supply truck on a hot, dusty Tuesday afternoon. It was a standard GMC CCKW, a 6x6 truck that was the unremarkable workhorse of the U.S. Army. It backed up to the camp's supply depot, a large wooden warehouse near the infirmary. A detail of soldiers, grumbling about the heat, began to unload its cargo. The women were in the common area nearby, mending their clothes, another bafflingly normal activity they had been assigned. They watched the unloading with idle curiosity, the scene a familiar part of the camp's rhythm. But this time, the cargo was different. It wasn't just crates of K rations or sacks of potatoes. This truck was for the infirmary. The soldiers started forming a chain, passing down wooden crates stamped with the Red Cross and black stenciled lettering. Chio, standing near the barracks door, felt her heart begin to beat faster. She could read some of the English words: penicillin, blood plasma, type O, sulfanilamide powder, morphine tartrate, surgical kit field. Crate after crate came out of the truck. The pile on the loading dock grew to an impossible size. There were boxes of sterile cotton gauze, not in small rolls, but in massive bolts. There were cartons containing thousands of glass vials. There were canisters of ether and chloroform. The sheer volume was staggering, an avalanche of medical wealth. It was more supplies than Chio had seen in her entire 10 years of service with the Imperial Army, all delivered by a single truck on a single day afternoon to a single insignificant prisoner of war camp on a remote island in the Pacific. It was in that moment that the final critical piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Chio, and through her, for the other women who watched in stunned silence. The kindness, the good food, the clean blankets, the professional medical care, they were not a trick. They were not a sign of moral weakness or decadent softness. They were a symptom of a power so total, so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the very fabric of the enemy's nation that it was beyond their comprehension. This was not the strength of soldiers or the brilliance of generals. This was the strength of factories that never stopped running, of farms that produced endless surpluses, of a logistical network that could project that surplus across an entire ocean with breathtaking efficiency. It was the strength of a society that could afford to see human life, even an enemy's life, not as a disposable resource, but as something to be preserved, simply because it had the means to do so. Their own nation, which they loved with a suicidal fervor, demanded that they sacrifice everything, their comfort, their health, their very lives. It had to, because it was poor and desperate. The Americans, it seemed, demanded very little sacrifice from their people, because they had so much of everything else. The realization was a silent, internal explosion. The war was not a contest of will, of spirit, of the purity of the Yamato race against the corruption of the West. It was a contest of production, of organization, of systems. And in that contest, they had been defeated before the first bomb ever fell on Pearl Harbor. The pile of medical supplies on that loading dock was a more decisive monument to their defeat than any captured flag or sunken battleship. It was a testament to a different kind of power, a quiet, overwhelming, administrative power that had made their fanatical, glorious, sacrificial struggle utterly and pathetically irrelevant. Chio looked at the tired, sweating American soldiers as they finished unloading the last crate. They were not Oni. They were not even conquerors. They were merely the deliverymen of an inevitable, crushing reality. The moment an ideology collapses is a profound historical event. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to uncover these pivotal turning points that have shaped our world. In the aftermath of that silent epiphany, a profound and heavy quiet settled over the Japanese women. The internal arguments ceased. The whispers of resistance and suspicion died away. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to suspect. The truth was as plain and solid as the crates stacked on the infirmary dock. They continued their routines, but something fundamental had shifted within them. Their movements were no longer stiff with defiance, but heavy with a resignation that was deeper and more complete than the mere fact of their capture. They had not just been defeated on the battlefield, their entire cosmology had been proven false. The Emperor was not divine, or if he was, his divinity was no match for the god of the assembly line. The spirit of Yamato was not invincible. It was a fragile thing that could be broken by a simple act of sustained, systematic, and impersonal decency. They began to observe their captors with a new, almost anthropological curiosity. The anger and hatred had been replaced by a bewildering mix of emotions, a grudging, bitter respect, a deep, corrosive envy, and a profound sense of their own nation's inadequacy. They watched as the guards played baseball in the evenings, their shouts and laughter echoing across the compound. The game seemed so pointless, so childish, yet the players pursued it with a relaxed intensity that was utterly foreign. Their world had room for such frivolous things. They saw the mail calls, the way the soldiers' faces would light up at a letter from home, the easy camaraderie they shared. They were not the brainwashed automatons of Japanese military life, bound by a rigid code of hierarchy and obedience. They were individuals, and their system somehow seemed to draw strength from that individuality rather than being weakened by it. It was another paradox they could not solve. When the news of the atomic bombs and the Emperor's subsequent surrender finally reached the camp, the women felt not shock, but a sense of grim, inevitable finality. For them, the war had already been over for weeks, lost on the day a single truck delivered a mountain of medicine. As they were prepared for repatriation, a strange and awkward ritual took place. The camp commandant, the same pale-eyed captain from their first day, assembled them. Through the Nisei interpreter, he wished them a safe journey home and a peaceful life. There was no gloating, no triumphalism. His tone was, as always, procedural and detached. Then a cook emerged from the mess hall, carrying a large box. Inside were dozens of Hershey's chocolate bars, one for each woman, a parting gift. Some of the women refused, turning their heads away in a final, vestigial act of pride. But others, including Akiko, the former zealot, slowly reached out and took one. She held the bar in her hand, feeling its weight, not looking at the captain or the guards, but at the object itself. It was no longer a symbol of decadent corruption. It was just a piece of chocolate, a small, sweet artifact from a world that had crushed hers. The long journey home to a devastated, occupied Japan was a voyage through a sea of silence. How could they explain what they had experienced? To their families, who had been fed the same propaganda, who believed them to be either dead or tainted by unspeakable dishonor. How could they describe the clean sheets, the abundant food, the life-saving medicine? How could they explain that their captors were not monsters, but simply men who followed a different and devastatingly more effective set of rules? To speak of it would sound like a confession of collaboration, a betrayal of all the suffering their people had endured. And so they remained silent. The memory of the camp became a private, shared secret, a complex and burdensome legacy that they would carry for the rest of their lives. It was not a memory of suffering, but of a kindness so profound and systematic that it had obliterated their sense of self, their faith, and their understanding of the world. They had gone into captivity as proud soldiers of the emperor, ready to die for a divine cause. They returned as quiet, haunted women, forever changed by the terrible, crushing weight of their enemies' humanity.